The battles at Imphal and Kohima won the British National Army Museum's poll in 2013 to determine Britain's greatest battle. Fought by the men of the 14th Army, the battles helped turn the tide of the war in the Far East and ultimately led to the defeat of the Japanese. In my previous video, I covered the battle at Imphal, and now I shall be tackling the Battle of Kohima. The Japanese in Burma knew that the British forces were gaining strength in India, and that its leaders were planning to re-invade Burma in the upcoming campaign season. Intending to preemptively eliminate the threat, the Japanese launched Operation Yugo, the invasion of India. Japanese 15th Army, numbering around 85,000 men strong, crossed the Chinwin River on the 8th of March 1944 and began pouring into India, hoping to capture the airfields and supply depots at Imphal, cutting off air supply to China and stopping the British invasion of India in its tracks. The Japanese also hoped to destroy the British in a decisive battle. But this was a very different British-led force than the one the Japanese had beaten in 1942. General Bill Slim, the commander of the 14th Army, had radically changed the fortunes of the men under his command, both tactically and in terms of their morale. The Japanese sent the 31st Division, led by General Sato, to take the town of Kohima, a town located on a ridge on the road to Imphal from Dimapur. If the Japanese could capture Kohima, the supply base at Dimapur would surely follow, and vital supplies for the defenders at Imphal would cease. The key issue with the Japanese plan was that their men had to capture British supplies during the operation, as they carried just 3 weeks' worth of rations on them. Without the capture of British supplies, the whole operation would be at risk of failing. By the 3rd of April 1944, the Japanese had reached Kohima, and their forward elements began to probe the British defenders. And to the south, Imphal was also under siege. The British at Kohima were vastly outnumbered, at around 6-1, and were desperately awaiting reinforcements to arrive to bolster their positions. Not only were they outnumbered, the British troops at Kohima were a mixture of combat and administrative soldiers. In the centre of Kohima, the British massed the majority of their combat troops at a position named Garrison Hill. For weeks, the British at Kohima were subjected to relentless Japanese attacks. The British were subject to intense artillery and mortar fire as the Japanese tried to push home their advantage. The British force were pushed back into an ever-shrinking perimeter, and it seemed nowhere was safe from Japanese fire. The Japanese attacked day and night, trying to exhaust and wear the British defenders out. Some of the heaviest and most brutal fighting took place on the northern end of Kohima Ridge, at the Deputy Commissioner's house and the tennis court. After the Japanese captured the house, the British retreated to one end of the tennis court, and the Japanese took up position at the other. Grenades were hurled back and forth at point-blank range, almost like a sick game of grenade tennis. The Japanese launched attack after attack over the tiny piece of ground separating the two sides, each just about repelled by the British. The British at Kohima refused to surrender, and were determined to fight to the last man, last bullet, and last inch of ground, as they knew capture by the Japanese was a one-way ticket to a slow and painful death. Thankfully for the men at Kohima, by mid-April, advanced units sent from Dimapur began to arrive, bolstering their defence as they successfully broke through the Japanese lines. But despite the arrival of British reinforcements, the Japanese refused to retreat, despite being desperately low on food, water and ammunition. The British continued to pour reinforcements into Kohima, but still the Japanese attacked, desperate to take their objective. The writing was on the wall for the Japanese by early May though, as British armour began to arrive, changing the fortunes of the defenders. By this time, the Japanese were starving and running desperately low on ammunition and manpower. Somehow the British at Kohima had held their position against overwhelming odds, and the Japanese, unable to break through, broke with tradition and began to pull back. The Japanese casualties in the attack on India was catastrophic. Of the roughly 85,000 men who took part in the operation, around 55,000 became casualties from battle, starvation and disease, with around 5,000 being killed at Kohima. It wasn't just the loss of an army that hurt the Japanese. The loss of thousands of weapons, artillery pieces, mortars, mules and horses significantly hampered their ability to defend the rest of the Burma from an upcoming British invasion. The British lost around 4,000 defending Kohima, with another 12,000 lost at Imphal. The victory for the British during the battles was a huge military moment, defeating an overwhelming enemy force while significantly outnumbered, but crucially, it was a great psychological boost. It showed that General Slim's tactics worked, and that the Japanese were not invincible and could be beaten. By May 1945, Burma was retaken by the British. The Battle at Kohima has often been described as the Stalingrad of the Far East for the savage and brutal fighting that occurred there. The epitaph at the war cemetery in Kohima has these famous words carved into it: "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today." Next time, I shall be discussing the Battle of the Admin Box, so don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn the notification bell on for the next part. Thank you all. I'll see you on the next one.